Vous êtes tous bienvenus à une autre session de notre série de conférenciers du Centre de droit de l'environnement et de la durabilité mondiale. It's so nice to see some familiar faces I haven't seen for a while. And so we're very, very pleased and honored that the commissioner has decided to take some time out of his very busy schedule to come and talk to us. So this is Jerry DeMarco, as I'm sure many of you know well. He is our new Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development with the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. Previously, he was the Commissioner of the Environment and Assistant Auditor General in the Auditor General's office at the provincial level in Ontario. He's also presided over hundreds of public environmental hearings and many administrative justice organizations at both the federal and provincial levels, including the Federal Environmental Protection Tribunal and the Ontario Environmental Review Tribunal. And he's also the author of many publications on environmental protection and the law. He's written a book about administrative tribunals. He wrote a brilliant article about many of the environmental law principles that I refer to constantly. And he set many important precedents before the Supreme Court of Canada, including in the Spraytech case, among many others. He was also the first recipient of the City of Toronto's Award for Environmental Leadership. He's both a lawyer and a planner, and he's just done so much throughout the country in so many different, wearing so many different hats to help to protect the environment. And as the new Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, he has written a groundbreaking report this year, among many other reports, but this year, this groundbreaking, hard-hitting report, which is extremely timely and overdue. And so we're so excited to have him not only in that role, but also to have him here with us today. So I'm just going to share my slide. Aussi, il va faire sa présentation de façon bilingue. Alors, je vais partager les diapos. Je pense que ça marche. Okay. So Commissioner DeMarco, please take the floor.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Professor McLeod-KilMurray, for the invitation to speak to all of you today. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So as Professor McLeod-KilMurray mentioned, this is a bilingual presentation. So she'll be sharing the French slides while I'm speaking English, and the English slides while I'm speaking French, or at least attempting to do so. So before I get into the details of slide one, I think it would be a good idea to answer the more general question of, what does the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development do? So not all of you may be familiar with the work of our office. And now that I've been in the position for a year, so maybe perhaps the newish commissioner rather than the new commissioner, Heather, I should be able to answer the question of what the commissioner does. So I work within the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, and the commissioner's position was established in the 1995 amendments to the Auditor General Act. And I'll give a little bit of detail about our jurisdiction because we have several lawyers, law professors, and law students in the audience today. So the commissioner is appointed by the Auditor General of Canada, Karen Hogan, and the commissioner typically reports to Parliament in the spring and fall annually. The legal requirement is at least once a year, but typically twice a year in practice, on anything that the commissioner considers should be brought to the attention of Parliament in relation to environmental and other aspects of sustainable development. So the key words are environment and sustainable development, as with the position title. And the mainstay of our work is auditing federal programs related to the environment and sustainable development as part of the Office of the Auditor General's overall performance audit mandate. And that's set out in Section 7 of the Auditor General Act. And there's included in there a specific provision regarding auditing the environmental effects and amongst the other 3 E's of economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. So there's also a collection of matters that the commissioner does that relate to sustainable development strategies at the federal level and the Federal Sustainable Development Act specifically. And this includes commenting on the draft Federal Sustainable Development Strategy that comes out every few years, including this year. So we'll be commenting on the new draft Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. We do that under Section 9 of the of the Federal Sustainable Development Act. We examine the fairness of the federal government's progress reports relating to the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy under Section 23(3) of the Auditor General Act. We review the implementation of departmental sustainable development strategies annually under Section 23(2) of the Auditor General Act. And we also, when applicable, report on the exercise of authority under Sections 12.2 and 12.3 of the Federal Sustainable Development Act, usually when the federal government adds designated entities that are subject to the requirement to produce sustainable development strategies. So we do all of those things. We also manage the environmental petitions process and report on that annually. The environmental petitions process is a mechanism whereby any Canadian resident or organization can bring concerns about the environment to the attention of federal ministers, and the ministers are required to respond. So we transmit those petitions to the minister, and the minister is then required to respond to those public petitions. And even though they're called petitions, they can be submitted by as few as one person. We also engage internationally, especially within the rubric of sustainable development goals and monitoring the federal government's performance in implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we also have a new role under the Net Zero Act, and that I'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation, but it does provide a good segue in terms of the main focus of today's talk, which is on climate change, and specifically the lessons learned report we released in November. So if you could go on to slide 1, Heather. We've, as you can see from that slide, our office has been reporting on climate change for quite some time, over 2 decades. And there's been a marked increase in the reports on the subject of climate change over the past decade, which is the box on the right side of the screen. And you'll see a number of topics that we've covered over the years. You know, a little less than 1 per year for the first decade, and now usually 2 or more for the current cycle and the upcoming cycle. I should note that on the right side of the screen, the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subjects listed there, from carbon pricing downwards, those are all reports that are in production. So those are the ones that are ongoing, that we will report on later this year. So we've certainly ramped up our activity on climate change over the past decade, including the fall 2021 report on lessons learned, which we'll be talking about today. So the next slide just sets out, you know, what the report was all about. It's a bit of an unusual report. It wasn't a performance audit like most of our reports, but it was, you know, tying together 3 decades of Canadian action and inaction on climate change, and trying to provide value looking forward in terms of lessons that could be learned from those 3 decades of action and inaction, so that Canada could perform better in the future. And, you know, as auditors, our role is to look at the performance of government. And in this case, we decided, rather than to look at a fairly short time period, which is often the case with performance audits, for this lessons learned report, we looked at the full 3 decades since, well, slightly more than 3 decades now, since Canada started to commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The report is based on the Office of the Auditor General's audit work in the past, and we've summarized all of our reports from the past couple of decades in an appendix to the lessons learned report. We also interviewed senior climate experts, former government officials, and former commissioners of the environment and sustainable development to get the full picture for the past 30 years in Canada. So the next slide is something that many of you are quite aware of, but it's essentially, you know, a little bit of a graphic that explains or illustrates the differing types of effects that climate change has and the risks that they pose to Canadians from the far north in terms of reduced ice cover and degrading permafrost and the effects that that has on communities and traditional ways of life, to, well, just about everywhere, but more recently in the West, increased wildfires, putting people at risk, as well as wildlife and habitat, more frequent heat waves, which we heard lots about last year, especially with the situation in British Columbia and Lytton, BC in particular, but also in other parts of the country. We have the not only, more heat waves, but also intense rainfalls, and that has affected again BC last year, but also the East Coast, and in prior years increased severe rainfall events all across the country. We've had increased frequency of droughts that affect agriculture and forests, and we've had ecosystem changes that shift species distributions or cause species to go into decline and put species at risk, and put also food supplies at risk. And of course, we have rising sea level and increased erosion in coastal areas. So quite, as a large country, we're experiencing just about all of the major effects of climate change, with increased frequency and magnitude over the recent past. So if we go on to the next slide. So this slide really is the main message regarding performance in our report. And, in short, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions have risen substantially over the past 3 decades, despite repeated commitments to lower them. So this is not a good news story. This graph is showing 3 decades of plans starting from 1990. And as everyone knows, the international community gathered together on this issue shortly thereafter in 1992 to create the Framework Convention on Climate Change in Rio. And with domestic and international initiatives, Canada has had its emissions increase by about 20% since they began their commitments to first stabilize and then decrease emissions. So the graph is going in the wrong direction. And it's not that everybody is going in the wrong direction. We happen to be the worst performing country in the G7 since the early 1990s in terms of percentage change in emissions of greenhouse gases. And we're also the worst amongst the G7 since the landmark Paris Agreement in 2015. So if you look back a few years, or if you look back 3 decades, the story is the same in terms of Canada performing poorly against G7 nations. And this is despite the fact that Canada took a leadership role in the late 1980s and early 1990s on this issue, and certainly was one of the industrial nations that was pushing for action on climate change. We hosted the 1988 conference that really kickstarted international action on climate change, and there's a quote from that in our report on the first page. We issued the Green Plan in 1990 in terms of a domestic commitment, and we helped lead industrial nations in the Rio Convention, or the Rio Conference in 1992, where this climate change convention was signed, as well as the important biodiversity convention. But since then, emissions have gone up, as I mentioned, 20% over the last 3 decades. So no matter how you look at this graph, you can't help but conclude that we've had no shortage of climate commitments and plans, the names of which are listed on this graphic. But what has been lacking is tangible progress in reducing emissions. Going the wrong way is essentially what's happened over the last 30 years in Canada. So what lessons can we learn from this? I mean, it's all well and good to say we've had failure after failure, and we've had plans and commitments that haven't been accompanied by action. But what can we learn from this going forward, so that if we do another lessons learned report some years from now from our office, that perhaps we can have a graph that's seeing a decrease in emissions and an evaluation that is positive rather than negative. So let's move on to the lessons, and I'll switch to French for the next little while, and Heather has kindly put up the English slides for this section of the presentation. So, leçon numéro 1, c'est un leadership et une coordination plus efficace sont nécessaires pour faire progresser les engagements envers la lutte contre le changement climatique. Les changements climatiques ne connaissent pas de frontières, alors pour s'attaquer à la crise climatique, il faut le leadership et la coordination de tous les niveaux de gouvernement. Et on parle des opportunités, des circonstances favorables pour chaque des 8 leçons. Et sur ce diapo, nous avons donné des exemples de ces opportunités ou ces circonstances favorables pour améliorer la situation. Pour cette leçon ici, on peut centraliser, on peut considérer la centralisation des responsabilités au sein de l'administration fédérale. Le Conseil des ministres de France, par exemple, qui c'est l'équivalent du cabinet au Canada, a placé les responsabilités en matière de changement climatique au cœur de l'action gouvernementale, au lieu de confier ces responsabilités à un ministère en particulier qui a des compétences et des pouvoirs plus limités. On peut tenir compte des besoins des provinces et des territoires. Le Royaume-Uni a réussi à dépolariser certains aspects du débat sur le changement climatique et le Royaume-Uni a un organisme indépendant sur le climat, leur comité sur le changement climatique, établi dans le cadre de la loi sur le changement climatique du pays, qui conseille le gouvernement sur la cible de réduction des émissions. Et autrement, on peut mettre fin ou essayer de mettre fin à la polarisation du débat sur l'action climatique. Alors, le leadership, c'est la première leçon. Leçon numéro 2, est-ce qu'on peut procéder à la prochaine diapo? Le prochain diapo. C'est l'économie canadienne reste tributaire de secteurs qui rejettent de grandes quantités d'émissions. Ce n'est pas une surprise, on sait ça. L'industrie pétrolière et gazière est importante au Canada. Elle représente presque 8% de notre GDP et 23% de nos exportations en 2019. C'est aussi le plus grand émetteur de gaz à effet de serre au pays. Alors, quelles sont les opportunités de circonstances favorables pour améliorer la situation? Des exemples, on peut regarder le financement à long terme. Alors, la Norvège gère ses richesses pétrolières par l'intermédiaire d'un fonds, le Government Pension Fund Global, qui a été créé pour protéger l'économie contre les fluctuations des revenus pétroliers. On peut diversifier des sources de production d'énergie. On peut protéger des travailleuses et des travailleurs et des collectivités. L'Union européenne, par exemple, a établi le mécanisme pour une transition juste qui vise à injecter environ 183 milliards de dollars entre 2021 et 2027 dans les régions à forte intensité de carbone et à production élevée de combustibles fossiles qui sont les plus touchés par la transition énergétique, la transition à la carboneutralité. Un autre exemple, la stratégie énergétique nationale du Royaume-Uni, qui est un plan national en 10 points du pays qui décrit comment le Royaume-Uni s'y prendra pour nettoyer son système énergétique afin d'atteindre la carboneutralité d'ici 2050. La troisième leçon, alors le prochain diapo, c'est l'adaptation. Des mesures d'adaptation doivent être priorisées pour éviter les effets les plus graves des changements climatiques. Les sécheresses, les inondations, les canicules, les feux de forêt et les tempêtes deviennent de plus en plus graves, comme j'ai dit il y a quelques minutes, et se produisent plus souvent. Ces événements posent des risques pour l'infrastructure, les localités côtières et nordiques, les pêches, les écosystèmes et même la santé humaine. Alors, quelques exemples d'opportunités ou de circonstances favorables. L'action fédérale avec une stratégie nationale d'adaptation. Alors, on peut coordonner au niveau national une stratégie pour adapter au changement climatique. Au niveau régional et local, ou comme on dit, infranational, on a des exemples ici, comme la Première Nation, une Première Nation en Colombie-Britannique qui a lancé un projet communautaire de planifier la résilience au changement climatique. Ce projet prévoit des évaluations de la menace et de la vulnérabilité et l'élaboration et la mise en œuvre d'un plan d'action de 10 ans sur le changement climatique. Et on peut aussi on peut avoir une mise en œuvre précoce des mesures d'adaptation. Par exemple, en 2012, il y a 10 ans maintenant, Vancouver a adopté une stratégie d'adaptation au changement climatique pour recenser et prioriser la vulnérabilité et guider l'élaboration de politiques et de programmes de renforcement de la résilience. Alors, ça, c'est des exemples au niveau d'adaptation. La leçon numéro 4, alors la prochaine diapo. Le Canada risque de prendre du retard par rapport des autres pays dans les investissements en faveur d'un avenir résilient face au changement climatique. Alors, le changement climatique, comme vous savez, ne menace pas seulement l'environnement, ils peuvent aussi avoir un gros impact sur les marchés financiers. Alors que des autres pays s'orientent vers une économie faible de carbone et vers la carboneutralité, le Canada risque de prendre du retard s'il ne fait pas de même. Quels sont des exemples d'opportunités? Alors, comme beaucoup de vous savez, en 2015, le Conseil de stabilité financière, un organisme international, a créé le groupe de travail sur l'information financière relative au changement climatique. Ce groupe était chargé d'élaborer un ensemble uniforme d'informations à fournir à titre volontaire relativement aux risques financiers associés au changement climatique, à l'intention des sociétés qui communiquent de l'information aux investisseurs, aux prêteurs et aux compagnies d'assurance et d'autres parties prenantes. On peut intégrer le développement durable à la finance. Par exemple, le Banque du Canada s'est joint au réseau pour le verdissement du système financier, un forum mondial de banques centrales et de superviseurs de systèmes financiers qui définit et préconise les meilleures pratiques concernant la gestion des risques climatiques dans le secteur financier et qui effectue des analyses sur les finances vertes. Et aussi, on peut aider aux pays en développement en ce qui concerne le changement climatique et y comprennent l'adaptation. La leçon numéro 5, alors prochaine diapo. Alors, leçon numéro 5, il est primordial d'accroître la sensibilisation du public et à la problématique de changement climatique pour progresser. Étant donné que les actions collectives et l'appui de la population sont importants pour faire évoluer les politiques et les comportements, une sensibilisation insuffisante du public à l'égard des changements climatiques risque d'entraver le progrès réalisé par le Canada pour lutter contre le changement climatique. Alors, ces leçons sont liées un peu une autre leçon avec la dépolarisation. La sensibilisation peut aider à dépolariser le débat. On peut faire ça par communiquer des objectifs politiques, communiquer dans une meilleure façon des objectifs politiques, le renforcement de la transparence avec les actions en ce qui concerne le changement climatique. On peut élever le discours public en ce qui concerne le changement climatique. Alors, le gouvernement le fédéral ici au Canada a pris certaines mesures pour sensibiliser le public à la problématique du changement climatique. Un des objectifs présentés dans l'évaluation nationale du Canada, au titre de faire progresser nos connaissances pour agir, qui était publié en 2019, par Ressources naturelles Canada, par NRCan, prévoit qu'il faut accroître la sensibilisation de la pertinence du changement climatique auprès des Canadiens et la nécessité de mesures opportunes. Et récemment, le gouvernement a rendu public un investissement de 3 millions de dollars pour la sensibilisation de 300 000 enfants sur ce qu'ils peuvent faire pour aider le Canada à atteindre sa cible de 2050. Toutefois, il faut du temps pour sensibiliser le public et avoir des résultats, c'est-à-dire un changement dans le comportement des citoyens du Canada. La prochaine leçon, numéro 6, c'est que les cibles, c'est lié à ce que j'ai dit entièrement, les cibles climatiques n'ont pas été appuyées par des plans solides ou des actions ici au Canada. Alors, des cibles ambitieuses de réduction des émissions sont exigées pour limiter le réchauffement de la planète à 1,5 degré Celsius, mais les pays doivent aussi s'assurer de prendre des mesures pour atteindre ces objectifs. Alors, les objectifs, les plans sont bons, ils sont nécessaires, mais on a besoin de résultats. Et ça, c'est un des messages clés de notre rapport. Et on a des exemples ici avec des autres pays qui ont démontré de leadership à atteindre leurs cibles. Et on peut aussi avoir plus de responsabilité, de comptabilité en ce qui concerne les cibles et les plans. Et on a une nouvelle loi sur ce sujet dont je parlerai plus dans quelques minutes. Alors, the next slide, I'll switch over to English for the rest of the talk before we get to the Q&A. So lesson number 7. Enhanced collaboration among all actors is needed to find climate solutions. And this invitation today from Professor McLeod-KilMurray is an example of collaboration. So thank you again for inviting us. Addressing climate change requires all hands on deck, participation from the private sector, local communities, Indigenous people, financial institutions, academic institutions like today, civil society. That's essential for addressing what is a whole of society crisis. So there are many examples of at the international and subnational levels of non-government actors building momentum for climate action. We've listed a few here. The We Mean Business Coalition that includes more than 2,000 companies committed to climate action. These companies represent $24.8 trillion in market capitalization worldwide. We have Canada's new Climate Action and Awareness Fund that was announced a little less than 2 years ago, which will invest $206 million over 5 years to support Canadian-led projects that contribute to Canada's emissions reductions. We have an example of the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, publishing 7 principles for enabling Canada to meet its commitment to having net zero emissions by 2050, while fostering economic resilience and creating quality jobs. So lots of examples of collaboration, and that collaboration is crucial in in what is a global and whole of society crisis in the form of climate change. The next slide, and the last of the 8 lessons that we talk about in our report, is that climate change is an intergenerational crisis with a rapidly closing window for action. So this is a difficult issue to address in both government and private sectors that typically do not have long-term time horizons associated with their decision-making processes. So inaction on climate change now unfairly burdens future generations, and that's already happened in terms of the last few decades of inaction. That's burdened today's younger generation and the generations to come. They are experiencing, and the generations to come will experience, even greater effects from long-lasting greenhouse gases that have already been emitted. So what are some of the opportunities? There are international examples of countries addressing the intergenerational aspect of fighting climate change. Hungary and Wales as well, not on this slide, but Hungary and Wales are examples of dedicating a commissioner to the rights and interests of future generations to help try to overcome the short-term political interests that sometimes discount, or frequently, I should say, discount the future at the expense of future generations. We have the accountability and the role of Parliament in the form of, in Canada, of the new Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. We've had court decisions in other jurisdictions, including from France, that requiring the government to take all necessary steps within a certain time period to enable it to reach its climate crisis targets or face possible sanctions. So this is a tough nut to crack in terms of getting government and all other relevant actors to look beyond the here and now to, although the here and now is obviously important too, because climate change impacts have crystallized and become more visible over the last decade or two, but we also have to respect the rights and interests of the generations to come and to our current younger generation as well. So these last 8 slides have, as I mentioned, summarized the lessons learned that are set out in our report. And there's no magic. We summarized them into 8 lessons learned. We could have used a different taxonomy and had fewer or more than 8, but that was just our way of trying to summarize some of the key things we learned from our 2-decade-plus history of work in the area in the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, and from our interviews with experts, previous commissioners, government officials, and so on. And we elected to focus the slides that I've just gone through on, as I mentioned, the opportunities that exist for progress on each of these 8 topics. And we strike a somewhat optimistic tone on the last page of our report, hoping that there will be progress, and that graph that I demonstrated earlier will bend downwards, and not just because of economic contractions from COVID, but will bend down permanently. And if you're interested in reading more about each of these 8 lessons learned and the topics that we've covered in this report, I would recommend that you download our report from our website, because we also have extensive sections on the challenges, so some of the more negative issues that have arisen over the last 3 decades, and a list of questions that you can pose, that parliamentarians can pose, or anyone can, for that matter, pose to government officials and to others regarding these 8 lessons learned, and in the course of seeking accountability for government action on climate change. So that provides a bit of a segue into this last slide here, which is, as I mentioned a couple of times earlier in this program, we just go back to that slide, Heather. We have a new piece of legislation from last summer, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, that expanded the commissioner's mandate to beyond the mandates listed in the Auditor General Act and the Federal Sustainable Development Act. So we have this new mandate with a deadline to issue our first report within a couple of years from now. And it enshrines in law Canada's 2050 target, as well as milestones from 2030 to 2050 to guide the country towards net zero. Section 24 of that act, and with this audience, with a lot of people with a legal background in this audience, we would be interested in hearing any comments that you have on how we should best implement this new role under the Net Zero Act. We're required to report on the Government of Canada's implementation of the measures aimed at mitigating climate change, something we've been doing already, but now we have a statutory requirement to report on the implementation of those measures. And we also have, under the subsection 2 of section 24 of the Net Zero Act, we can include recommendations related to improving the effectiveness of the Government of Canada's implementation of the measures with respect to climate change mitigation. So this focuses on mitigation rather than adaptation. And we would be interested in hearing, either today during the session or through our public inquiry email address on our website, thoughts that you may have on how we could best carry out this new mandate, including how we should scope our first report in the coming years, how frequently we should report. The minimum is every 5 years under the Act, but we could go more frequently if we elect to do so. So we'd be interested in people's thoughts on especially what role the Commissioner can play in carrying out this new mandate without duplicating efforts that will be made by the advisory panel under the Act, or perhaps by government itself under the Act. So I think we're probably ready to move on to questions. With me today are Elsa DaCosta and Kirsten McCodsey from the Office of the Auditor General of Canada to assist with the Q&A, especially with the A part of the Q&A. And I haven't been, focusing on delivering my remarks and so on. I haven't been able to watch the chat, so I'm presuming that Heather, you're watching the chat and that you'll select questions to pose for us, and I'll just sort of pay attention to what you're saying as opposed to trying to go through the chat. I can only do so many things at once.
Yes.
And while we do that, I'm going to have my first drink of water in a few minutes, just to make sure that I can provide some answers.
Well, thank you so much. That was a lot to think about, and I absolutely love the fact that it was so focused on solutions and enabling governments and the private sector, the financial sector, and individual citizens to help move us forward more rapidly. So the first question here is talking about lesson 2, Canada's economy is still dependent on emission-intensive sectors. The question is, one of the opportunities that was found was diversifying energy production. Ontario has successfully implemented a policy to put an end to coal use in 2014. This energy transition has been referred to as the single largest GHG reduction measure in the world since 2000. Over 90% of replacement energy came from non-emitting nuclear energy generation. Might you have any comments on the lessons learned specific to nuclear energy or Environment Canada's small modular reactor action plan?
Yeah, so the having been the commissioner in Ontario, quite familiar with the attempts by the previous government to increase renewable energy and other non-emitting, non-GHG emitting sources like nuclear. Certainly the momentum on the renewable energy side in Ontario has dissipated in the last few years, but they were among the leaders in that for a time. And as you mentioned, as the person posing the question mentioned, the closure of the coal-fired plants in Ontario, so they were generating a lot of Ontario's power, but also a lot of Ontario's emissions. They were closed. I think that file, the history shows that the file gained momentum initially as a mechanism to address local and regional air pollution, and then sort of evolved into the co-benefit of addressing greenhouse gas emissions. And so there was, the health effects that were being addressed by reducing smog in Ontario from those generating stations, as well as the climate side of things. So that was a major step in the right direction in Ontario, addressing its curve of emissions, which is not bad a news story as the Canadian one as a whole that was on my earlier slide. Nuclear and other non-emitting sources are obviously part of the equation. I can't say what the makeup will be amongst solar, hydro, nuclear, wind, geothermal, all the various ones that will come into play, and that will obviously vary regionally too, depending on the resources that they have available. But we're currently looking into nuclear on the waste side of things. We have an audit ongoing on low and medium level waste, and certainly that's one of the key issues, right? Is the continued reliance on nuclear. We eventually do need to have a solution on what to do with the waste that's been put off for several decades, and if it's going to play a bigger role, then all the more important that we find a long-term solution for the waste. So those are sort of my initial thoughts on that topic. One thing we do mention in the report, and tying it back to our report, is if we're going to move more towards the net zero and the electrification of vehicles and energy sources, there's going to be more of a call for a national energy strategy, as well as more of an integrated grid as well. So that's another aspect that will need to be addressed, not only in Canada, but in a lot of countries where they are moving away from fossil fuel energy to sources to power the grid that are renewable or non-emitting.
I think there's 2 or 3 more questions in the chat, so I'll just do them quickly, and then I see that Isabel also has a question. So this one is, I'm interested in the roles of the Net Zero Advisory Board and your office in respective reporting on progress in meeting the federal government's GHG emission reduction targets. Is there overlap? You know, I think you sort of mentioned this is evolving, but.
Yeah, I asked the same question, Isabel. Thank you for that. And it's something we will have to answer over the next year or two before we issue our first report. So we know what it says in the Act, and our section of the Act 24, if we can call it that, the section that is pointed in our direction, says that we are to report on the implementation of measures aimed at mitigating climate change, and we may include recommendations on improving the effectiveness of those measures. So, well, it's a good question. The advisory body under that Act may get into that field as well, maybe not to the same way that an audit office would be, but I would imagine they'll be making frequent recommendations on improving the effectiveness. So we would like to sort out our niche within the realm of satisfying our legal obligations under Section 24, but in a way that adds value rather than duplicates the work of the advisory panel, the advisory body, or other non-governmental organizations or international organizations. So we're at the stage of seeking input for that, just informally, but through mechanisms like today. And we also have a team that's working on generating options over the next several months. So any thoughts that you have or your colleagues have on where it's best to focus our energies in Section 24 of that Act without duplicating efforts, that would be very valuable for us to hear. Keeping in mind that we may look at some of the same issues as other bodies, including government itself and advisory, but we may look at it from an audit lens with access to all of that information that other bodies may not have. So we can certainly look into similar issues, but in a different way at accessing different information. So that's one way to avoid overlap and adding value. Or we could look at entirely different issues that those bodies aren't looking at. So we're all ears on that, and look forward to any input that anyone has on how we can best carry out that mandate.
Okay, so here there's sort of 2 linked comments here. One says, a cabinet directive has been in effect for decades, requiring reporting and consideration of sustainability of all proposed policies, programs, or spending, but has yet to be adhered to or made publicly accountable. And related to that, many standing committee reviews have recommended greater investment in energy efficiency, but what about focuses on reducing energy use?
Okay, so I'm going to ask Elsa to unmute and help with summarizing a bit of our work over the years on that, long before I arrived a year ago, especially under the rubric of strategic environmental assessment, sustainable development strategies, and sustainable development goals. We've been in on all of those areas over the years, and maybe Elsa could provide a bit of information to the person who posed this question.
Sure, Jerry, I'd love to. So I think the cabinet directive that's being referred to, just so I'm clear, is the reporting on results. And the where the reporting on sustainable development currently fits in is more attached to the FSDA Act in terms of the departmental sustainable development plans. So where that lives, unfortunately, it lives in an annex of the departmental plans and the departmental reports. So you have to do a bit of digging, because when you get to the departmental plans, where you want to find where that information is usually found is in annex of the DSDS annex, the Department of Sustainable Development Plan and report on both of those kind of things, that there are annual plans and reports that get submitted by the departments. They usually now have to fit a bit more information on how these links to the SDGs in the plans and in departmental reporting, but that cabinet directive really focuses on the departmental plans that have to be submitted annually, and the departmental reports that have to also be submitted, and the sustainable development component often lives in an annex of those reports, and those require a bit of internet digging. They're public, but that's where they usually live. In terms of our work and Jerry's legislative work, we have to review those, and we've often taken different angles in our revisions. We did SCA work for a number of years, or whether or not departments were doing that. Every 3 years, every year we have to report on, review if the DSDSs are, the last 3 years we were looking a bit more on how they were kind of set up a little bit in terms of setting results, and whether or not the indicators were working, and how all those things are aligned, and our reports show that they're not doing a really good job on that as well. So in terms of understanding the results and what are the outcomes of federal policies, it makes that a little bit more challenging. And you might have to dig a little bit in the plans and the results report to see where that is, where that lives, and what policies are reporting on in there. But typically all of the policies and the reporting and the indicators used should be in those annexes. Not that they're doing a great job in our view, but that's where that would be.
So thank you, Elsa. And one thing I would add is that this question and the topic illustrates a larger question of horizontal initiatives. So within the federal government, you have silos, the departments. They try to work together on certain things, but they certainly are set up in a vertical manner, not in a horizontal manner. And you have initiatives like strategic environmental assessment, sustainable development strategies, sustainable development goals from the UN, gender-based analysis, plus these things that are layered on all of the departments simultaneously, but there isn't necessarily a coordinated attempt, or a coordinated enough attempt to deal with them all across government in a coordinated way. The risk that has is that they become checklists and reporting and reports, and hard to find, as Elsa may have mentioned, and they aren't really having the desired impact on decision making. They're more of an add-on as opposed to a true lens through which the decision is passing. This is the criticism that was made of environmental assessment dating back to the 70s, right? Is that it was just, it could be, it wasn't designed to be, but it could be just a checklist to fill out after you've made the key decision of whether you're going ahead or not. And certainly there's been some progress on better implementing horizontal initiatives in the federal government, but there's a long way to go. One positive is that I expect to see in the next iteration of the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy more of an integration between the work under the Federal Sustainable Development Act and the work being done under the rubric of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They're both about sustainable development, but up until now, they've been managed by different departments, in fact, not just different programs. And that would be one thing that would be good to see a better integration. Thanks for the question.
I think, Isabel, thank goodness you virtually had your hand up, otherwise you would have a very sore arm. So please go ahead.
That's okay. I'm going to do my best to speak in English. I've been studying this for the past 2 years, and mostly in French, but you will, I'm sure you will be understanding. So yes, talking about what can have an impact on the reduction of CO2 emissions. Sorry to say, I'm a PhD student, law and education. So yes, I would like to talk about current generations and future generations and the importance of education and action for climate empowerment, as stated in the Paris Accord and the I don't know the name in English, and the CCNU, that's in French, the 1992 framework convention, I think. So anyways, what I would like to say is that Canada, of course, has to report on the different measures they are taking, of course, to in relation to their targets to it. And action for climate empowerment, as out of close to 400 pages, there was only 12 pages dedicated to education. And if we look at studies, like for example, a study from California from Professor Cordero from 2020, they have sort of looked into how education can in fact reduce CO2 emissions. And they found that it can reduce it by up to 2.86 tons per person. And so, of course, for me, having been a teacher for the past 26 years, and it's a sort of complicated situation, but I was in law before. So I'm really looking at how we can mobilize the rights of education to better serve the right to a safe environment and healthy environment. And I'm looking at it from a perspective of children's right, of course. So if we look, at, for example, SDG 4.7 and SDG 13, and we look as well at the preamble of the Paris Accord, which says that from now on, we're going to have to consider the rights, of human rights in our policies. So, and currently I'm working with Centraire in establishing, it's called in French, Stratégie québécoise d'éducation en matière d'environnement et d'éco-citoyenneté. So they are going to present this to the legislature in Quebec because we need teachers to teach differently. We need also teachers to teach about human rights to students. And I know, because I've been a teacher for the past 26 years, it's not being done. Yeah. And so, of course, yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So okay. I know it's a provincial jurisdiction, but I know that non-formal education, something can be done. So I don't know if any thought is going to be given on that.
Yeah, lots of thoughts on that, and thank you for the question. So I would say that lessons 5 and 8 from our report are the most pertinent to this issue. In fact, when we were first laying out this report, lesson 5 initially had, just as a placeholder, had education in the title, but for the reasons that you just said, it's more of a provincial issue. So we broadened it to public awareness, but education is a part of public awareness, of course.
Yes.
And education is critical, as you mentioned, not only on this, but it's, history has demonstrated that education in terms of equality rights, poverty, all these things, that education is key to making progress, not only on environmental issues, but many issues of sustainable development, equality, and so on. So I would say that, this is, it's something that has progressed. So I'm looking back now, to the beginning of our graph from 1990 and the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. I was sort of in the younger generation at the Rio conference in 1992 and trying to stand up for my my generation at that time as a university student. And there weren't very many youth or young people invited to or participating in those sorts of conferences back then, 30 years ago, I guess this year. But that's really changed. The youth aren't waiting for adults to give them opportunities to become engaged or waiting for the right curriculum. They're seizing the opportunity and standing up for themselves and for their successor youth in the next generation. So I am actually quite positive about the momentum on education, and I wouldn't call it just the traditional education of adults telling youth about the ways of the world and so on. It's the youth are telling us quite a bit too, and we can learn as much from them. And they have more of a stake in it because they have a longer period of their lifespan left that's going to be lived in an era of increased climate change effects. So yeah, kudos to you for working on that and pushing the agenda on public awareness and education in particular. It's something that I think, especially respect for future generations, and I'm thinking back to when I was writing about that subject like 20 years ago. It's often been part of the dialogue, but I don't know if there's really been a lot of effort in operationalizing the principle of intergenerational equity. It's more of a catchphrase than it is a mandate for action amongst government departments. It's something that we're looking to in whether we can do more on that as part of Lesson 8. We're actually learning Lesson 8 a bit ourselves in the design of some of our future reports, including this report itself, by looking at a longer time frame than we typically would in an audit, and some of the root causes are not necessarily visible to problems if you look at them in too short of a time period. And so, yeah, so great question. There was a lot there, so hopefully I touched on some of the aspects, but I know I didn't cover everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat, but feel free to raise your hand if you wanted to ask a question or to volunteer any ideas for the commissioner about the new role under the Act. I guess I can exercise my prerogative as moderator to ask a question. So I know in a lot of various climate change and other sustainability reports that we talk a lot about energy, which clearly is crucial. But one of my new areas of interest is food systems. And we know that food systems are a huge part of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, and really focusing very much on emissions, for example, methane emissions coming from food waste and industrialized animal agriculture. So I just wondered if you're seeing an increase in attention and focus on these issues in some of your work.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Heather. Yeah, agriculture issues, diet issues, which was sort of a almost something that you were not allowed to talk about 10 or 20 years ago in terms of the impact that we have through our diet. Usually we talked about home heating and travel and so on, but we didn't talk too much about the diet and the impact that has on the planet. But yeah, agriculture is a huge issue, not just in terms of emissions of methane and so on, but also habitat loss and so on, and water use especially. So we have an increased attention to that. I mean, we obviously put the role of agriculture, I think it was in lesson number 2, we talked about sort of the major components of emissions, and with methane in particular, because even though it's shorter lived in the atmosphere, it has a much higher warming potential. That's really important. It's also something that you can turn around more quickly than some of the other things that will require decades of investment in terms of changing technology, the reliance on the technologies and energy production. So I think it's an emerging issue, and one that I think that governments and individuals can address, through the choices that they make in terms of the the types of food they buy and the locations of the production of the foods that they buy, or the environmental footprint of the types of foods they buy. So government hasn't done a lot on that yet, but I think it's especially on the methane file, they can't avoid it if we're going to reach net zero and also sustain the soils and the biodiversity and all the other things related to agriculture. Then we definitely have to tackle it.
I know government seem to be afraid of the meat issue, but I think the food waste issue might be more amenable. And like you say, you'd think policymakers would like this because it's a short-term win. It's a big win if you explain that to them. Anyway, thank you. I was interested in that, and I think Linda Duncan has a question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, it's great to see you, Jerry. Couldn't think of a better guy to end up being our commissioner, our Alberta star. Your sister's a star too. She articled with my dad. Okay. And thanks for your attempt to reply to my question, Jerry. There is a separate cabinet directive that has been in place, I think, since the mid-1990s, and no federal government has ever followed it. I'm sorry I don't have the specific number. I've got it in one of my many boxes of paper I brought back from Ottawa. But there has been in place a separate cabinet directive that requires every government official in making any recommendation to their minister on policy, program, or spending to do a sustainability analysis and provide that. And in turn, any proposal by a minister to the cabinet on policy, program, or spending must do the same. And the Treasury Board is accountable for enforcing that and never has. In the previous parliament, I was encouraged by the then Treasury Board head. I spoke to her about that and she said, yes, I'm aware of that. I'm going to do something about it. And still nothing has happened. In your recommendation about more across government responsibility, that directive exists. It could be updated and clarified more greatly, but that directive across the board in government exists. It's not just specific to climate change. It is specific to all sustainability decisions. I made, as did your predecessor, Commissioner, made the recommendation to the parliamentary committee, the Standing Committee on Environment Sustainable Development, that legislatively, that Treasury Board directive and the requirements under the Sustainable Development Act be tied legislatively. And then we also recommended greater powers to yourself. So it's something that you might want to take a look at. It is a mechanism that's already in there and has been ignored by successive cabinets.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And what I'll do is I'll have Kirsten McCadsey from our office contact you to get more information about that. And all I can say at this point is, directives are fine, but as we've seen with things that are at the directive or policy level and not at the legislative level, including the last 30 years of targets and plans in Canada without a legislative basis, except for the short period of time that the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act was in place. Or for example, on gender budgeting, that's now been incorporated into law as well. So we'll have a look at that, and I'll have Kirsten from our office contact you to get more information about that, and we'll have a look.
Sure, great. Remember, the ERP guidelines order was a cabinet directive, and
Yeah.
Friends of the Old Man Supreme Court said that's legally binding.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the old ERPGO days. Yes, that was a long time ago. I think that was around the same time of Rio. Actually, it was the early '90s. Yeah,
That's right.
Great. Thank you so much. So last call for, oh no, here's another question. We have one more question, I think. So it's just a timing question for you, Jerry. So the speaker says, thanks for the presentation today and the information about the work of your office. Is there a projected timetable for completion of the 4 reports currently under preparation, in particular, the report on carbon price?
Yeah, so carbon pricing, we're aiming to have ready this spring. So that would be in our spring tabling. Some of the other ones will be into the fall, but carbon pricing is far along. So is just transition. And so you can expect to see those within the next 3 months.
Okay, well, I think yeah, so you had more comments. Thank you so much for the session and for your entire stellar career as an environmental champion. Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. And so thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you so much for doing these reports. They were outside of the norm, I think, and they're very important. And I think they're already getting traction from what I'm seeing in some reports in media, which having effects, which is so important. Alors, le centre tient aussi à chaleureusement remercier le Centre de recherche sur le futur des villes et le professeur Vincent Mirza qui est avec nous aujourd'hui. So it's great to have our centers collaborating on these issues. And again, thank you for all of the suggestions for action. And I hope that your work continues to, sort of light a sustainable fire under everybody to move us toward greater sustainability. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Elsa, and the whole team for a very smooth and very helpful presentation.
Well, thank you for having us, and have us back anytime. We'll be issuing more reports than we used to the last couple of years. So there should be, and I understand from one of your colleagues that a couple of the reports are part of the curriculum for the natural resources class. So
Yeah.
Another reason to have us here so that we can help with the students in their studies. So very happy to be here, and invite us back anytime.